Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I hope students you're enjoying the history of English literature. In the last lecture we were talking about literature in general, and then the importance of literature in the society, the relationship of literature and society, the importance of the writer's personality and literature, and then the types of the literature. So I hope you are enjoying learning. I hope you are enjoying learning history of English literature. Basically, my dear students, this is really a very good subject. So you'll enjoy a lot while studying different phases, different periods in the history of English literature. So this is lecture 3 of the semester. Today we will talk about I'll give you a briefing to the history of English literature, and then the different ages and the periods in the history of English literature. As you know that these periods and ages are very much important while studying English literature. So previously, so far, we have talked about what is literature, what is the difference between history and literature, and how literature fascinates you, role of imagination in studying literature, and how the writer transforms his imagination to the reader. So all these things are very much important, and I hope, my dear students, now the things would be much easy for you to learn. English literature background and development. As you know that English is one of the richest literatures of the world. It has a very significant place among other literatures of the world. Why? Because it is because of its vitality, rich variety and continuity. So this is everywhere in the whole world, because English is the world language. So everywhere, people in all parts of the world, they can understand English language, so they are fascinated towards English literature as well. And it has a rich variety. Like when we will be talking about the periods and the ages in the history of English literature, then you'll get to know that it has a rich variety as well and a continuity as well. There is a shift from one period to another. As I told you before as well, that literature is a reflection of any particular society. So a society is saved in the books of literature. There are various changes which have come about in English society from the earliest to the modern time, have left their stamp on English literature. So again we'll focus on English society plus English literature. How did English society influence on English literature, and how English literature developed with the passage of time, and will focus on different periods, different writers, on their works, and the socio political factors and the economical factors and the class factors which are involved in their writings. So we'll focus on each and everything during the whole semester. There are different phases in English literature. So this is not something which is just fixed to 1 century or 2 centuries only. It is a very rich literature, so it is comprised of different phases. There are certain transitions, certain ages in the history of English literature. That is why this is one of the richest culture among other literatures. That is why English literature is one of the richest literatures among other literatures of the world. So these phases, like the different phases which have come in different centuries, these phases are termed ages and periods. So my dear students, you have to keep in mind the concept of ages and periods as well, because we are dealing with the history of English literature. And now you can be confused as well that why there are ages and periods, why there is not only one period throughout the history of English literature. These periods and ages are named after the central literary figures or the important rulers of England. So basically we have named these ages and periods after the central literary figures, might be, or after any party which ruled over England for a period of time. So we give that name to that particular age or period as well. In history of English literature, we have ages of Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Dryden, Pope, Johnson, Wordsworth, Tennyson, Hardy. On the other hand, we have the Elizabethan age, Jacobean period, the age of Queen Anne, the Victorian age, and the Georgian period. So my dear students, here you'll have to focus on that we have, like, Chaucer is a poet, Shakespeare is also a poet, and you can see that these are the literary figures. So here we are supporting the previous point here, that we name these phases after the central literary figure. Any poet, any writer who had done any kind of marvelous work in that particular period, so we give that name to very century or to that very period. So these are the central literary figures in that particular period, in their particular period. So Elizabethan age, who was the dominating writer of that page? Obviously Shakespeare. The Jacobean period, we'll talk about different writers and poets in that period as well. And the age of Queen Anne, here you can see the important rulers of England. So we'll talk about political factors which are involved in the history of English literature as well. The Victorian age, this is also one of the ages, and the Georgian period, the age of King George. Some of these phases are named after certain literary movements or the classic, for example, as you can say, the classical age or the romantic age or the modern age as well. So we name them after certain literary movements. So these were the literary movements, for example, postmodern period in the history of English literature, or modern period as well. So after certain literary movements, we give that period that very name. So dear students, here you can see that there are certain factors which are involved in defining a period or an age. The fourth thing which is very much important again is we give a period a particular name after certain historical eras. For example, the medieval period, the Anglo-Saxon period, and the Anglo-Norman period. So here, my dear students, you can see, like, we give a period name after, you know, central literary. So my dear students, here you can see that we give a period name after central literary figures or the important rulers of England or the literary movements. Their names are dependent upon the literary movements, or they are based on certain important historical eras as well. So we'll talk about history of English literature in relation to these ages, periods, and centuries. Basically, who gave them the names? The names were given by some historians after the centuries, as the 17th century literature, 18th century literature, 19th century literature, and 20th century literature. So here you can see the vitality and the richness of English literature as well, that is, it is comprised of too many centuries. So sometimes we give any particular period the name of the century as well. So in relation to centuries, we'll talk about different writers and different poets as well, and we'll focus on their works. These ages and periods naturally overlap with each other, and they are not to be followed strictly. So my dear students, so you don't need to get worried about it, that it is very much difficult to memorize which age is this or which century is this. You are not supposed to follow these periods and ages strictly. You just have to keep in mind the concept only. But it is essential to keep them in mind in order to follow the growth of English literature. These ages and periods are very much important when we talk about the history of English literature, because we'll focus on the development and growth of this very literature as well. So the concept must be clear to you. You should know which writers or poets they belong to, which era. So that is the only thing which is important when we talk about ages and periods and centuries in history of English literature. And one more thing which you have to keep in mind, its salient and distinctive characteristics during the various periods of its development. So again, this is again very much important, that the salient characteristics of one period and the differences between one period and the other one. So you just have to keep in mind the basic concepts about periods. So you don't need to get worried, like sometimes these are called ages, sometimes these are called periods and centuries, and they are based upon some, you know, certain historical eras as well. So I can understand that it is a bit difficult for the students to keep in mind each and everything, but basically the purpose of today's lecture is to keep in mind the basic concepts only. Now let's have a critical survey of the background and development of English literature from the earliest times up to the present age. So we'll take a critical survey of all the eras, although that is not possible to cover all the eras in one lecture, because we'll give it a proper time to all ages, to all periods. But today I just want to give you a briefing about a history of English literature. So we won't discuss in detail all the periods and the ages today, but that is just a brief, a kind of a brief survey in order to give you in order to show you the vision of the history of English literature, what exactly that is. The Anglo-Saxon or Old English period, that was the first period in the history of English literature, which is known as the Anglo-Saxon. That period was started in 670 and was ended up in 1100. So this is again a very long period in the history of English literature. So I'll tell you the importance of this period in the development and growth of English literature. This period was started with Anglo-Saxon literature and the Angles and Saxons. These were the ancestors of the English race as well, much before they occupied Britain. So basically this is about two tribes. One was Angles and the other one was Saxons. So we'll focus on them. How did they conquer England, and what kind of literature they produced during their era. English was the common name and tongue of these tribes. These were the two tribes, Angles and Saxons. Before they occupied Britain, they lived along the coast of Sweden and Denmark. So here you can see that they came in England from Sweden and Denmark. So basically these two tribes, they were from Sweden and Denmark. And the land which occupied was called England. So basically when they occupied Britain, they gave it a name that was England. They ruled over England for a longer period of time. That is why their literature is also very much important. So my dear students, here you have to keep in mind the concept of Anglo plus Saxon, and then you know where they have come from, and the land which they occupied, that was England. These tribes were fearless, adventurous and brave, and during the later years of Roman occupation of Britain, they kept in British coast in terror. So they were very brave and they were very adventurous as well. That is why we can see this bravery and this adventurous that is why we can see their bravery in their literature as well. So they were quite fearless tribes and they were quite brave people. Next period in the history of English literature, the previously that was Anglo-Saxon period, that was started in 670 and ended up in 1100. So right after 1100 there was one more period in the history of English literature that is known as Anglo-Norman period or Middle English. Previously Anglo-Saxon period is known as Old English. So this is Middle English plus Anglo-Norman period. The Normans who were residing in Normandy in France defeated the Anglo-Saxon king at the Battle of Hastings. So here you can see there is a sudden shift from Anglo-Saxon period to Anglo-Norman period as well. So they defeated the Anglo-Saxon king in the Battle of Hastings. So my dear students, you have to keep in mind this thing, that the Normans, they defeated the Anglo-Saxon king in the Battle of Hastings and they conquered England. The Norman conquest inaugurated a distinctly new range in the literary as well as political history of England. So they influenced the literary plus the political history of England as well, because they brought an entirely new culture, entirely new political system there in England. So we'll discuss about it in detail. The Anglo-Saxon authors were then as suddenly and permanently displaced as the Anglo-Saxon king. So my dear students, here you can say that they replaced Anglo-Saxon literature because Anglo-Saxons, they were not allowed to publish their writings and they were not the ruling party as well. So a literature can be promoted if that is written by the persons who are ruling over a certain country. So that is why power is very much important to spread up your language or to spread your culture plus your literature everywhere in the whole world. Otherwise, if you are not powerful, nobody is going to follow you or nobody is going to use your language. For that purpose, you have to be strong economically, politically and socially as well in order to promote your culture and to promote your literature among the people of the society. The third period in the history of English literature, that is the Renaissance period, that was started in 1500 and ended in 1600. So this is comprised of a full-fledged century. It is also called the Elizabethan period or the age of Shakespeare. Here students, now you can see I am introducing different terminologies like Renaissance period, that is the name of the very period that was started in 1500. So here you can see this is also called the Elizabethan period and the age of Shakespeare as well. So whenever we talk about Elizabethan period, that is Renaissance period, or the age of Shakespeare, that is again the Renaissance period. The Middle Ages in Europe were followed by the Renaissance. So Renaissance period that came right after the Middle Ages. So this is also a very important period in the history of English literature. Renaissance means, so this is the revival of learning, the revival of learning. So this is the meaning of the Renaissance, and it denotes it in broadest sense the gradual enlightenment of the human mind after the darkness of the Middle Ages. So here, my dear students, you can see that how we are rejecting the concept, the philosophy which was introduced in the Middle Ages. So here we are saying that the darkness of the Middle Ages. So this is a transition from one period to another period. So this is an age of enlightenment, an age of reason. So this is the revival of learning as well. So when we talk about the Renaissance period, so basically our focus would be on Shakespeare and along with other writers as well. So this is the Elizabethan period plus the age of Shakespeare. The next period, or the age in the history of English literature, it was started in 1600 and ended up in 1660. So The literature of the 17th century may be divided into two periods. So here, basically, we are not just focusing on the Puritan age. You can see the 17th century, a full-fledged century. So it is divided into two periods. Period number one is the Puritan age or the age of Milton. So whenever somebody asks you that what do you mean by the Puritan age, so you can also say that is the 17th century literature or the age of Milton as well, which is further divided into Jacobean and Caroline periods after the names of the ruled James I and Charles I, who ruled from 1603 to 1625 and 1625 to 1649 respectively. So here, my dear students, you can see that we have divided 17th century literature into two phases. One is the Puritan age and the other one is the Restoration period. First of all, we will talk about the Puritan age, that is also known as the age of Milton, and it is further divided, as you can see here as well, it is further divided into Jacobean and Caroline periods as well after the names of the rule James I and Charles I. So James I ruled over England from 1603 to 1625 and Charles I ruled there from 1625 to 1649. So here you can see that the political figures which are very much important in that history, in the history of English literature. So we'll focus on that one as well, because literature is a reflection of the society. So whatever kind of society you have, basically you have, that would be reflected in form of literature, along with other factors like economical factors, social factors and political factors of that particular era. That was all about the Puritan age or the age of Milton. The next half of the century is dedicated to the Restoration period or the age of Dryden, and that was started in 1660 and ended up in 1700. So my dear students, here you can see we are talking about full-fledged whole century literature, that is 17th century literature, and we have divided it into two parts. One is about the Puritan age and the other one is the Restoration period, that is about the age of Dryden. So here you can see that how these ages and periods are interlinked with each other and how we give them different terminologies. Okay, for example, the Puritan age, that is basically the same thing, the age of Milton. The Restoration period, that is the age of Dryden. So that is a full-fledged 17th century literature. So when we talk about the Puritan age in detail, so definitely we'll focus on Milton plus Dryden along with the other writers and poets as well. The Restoration period, this is although a full-fledged period as well, but if we divide the history of English literature according to the century, so it comes in the 17th century literature. So we'll talk about Restoration period in a bit detail now. After the Restoration in 1660, when Charles II came to the throne, there was a complete negation of the Puritan ideals and ways of living. So here you can see within one century, the transition took place, and when Charles II came into power, so how he rejected the Puritan ideas and he introduced a new ideology in his society. So that is known as the Restoration period as well. In English literature, the period from 1667 is called the period of Restoration because the monarchy was restored in England, and Charles II, the son of Charles I, who had been defeated and beheaded, came back to England from his exile in France and became the king. So my dear students, here you can see the revival of the ruling party as well, like Charles II, his father, who was known as Charles I, who was sent on exile in France. He came back from France to England. So there was the restoration of monarchy in the country as well. So here you can see that how they rejected the Puritan ideas and introduced a quite new ideology in their society, which is very much important. 18th century literature. Previously, when we were talking about 17th century literature, two ages are very much important. One, or rather two periods are very much important, the Puritan Age and the Restoration period. So here, when we talk about the 18th century literature, that is called the Classical Age or the Augustan Age in literature. Previously, when we were talking about, the age of Milton or the Puritan Age, so we have given this 18th century literature name, that is the Classical Age or the Augustan Age. The Classical Age or the Augustan Age, so these are the different names of the literature that was there in 18th century. It is also called the Age of Good Sense or the Age of Reason. So Classical Age or the Augustan Age, that is called the Age of Good Sense and the Age of Reason as well. Fine. So if you find this kind of question, what do you mean by Age of Reason? So basically that is about the Classical Age or the Augustan Age. Why that is called the Age of Reason? We'll study about it in detail. Though Dryden belonged to the 17th century, he is also included in the Classical or Augustan Age, as during his time the characteristics of his age had manifested themselves and he himself represented them to a great extent. So previously, when we were talking about the Restoration period, and the dominating literary figure was Dryden over there, so we sometimes include Dryden in 18th century literature as well. Other great literary figures who dominated the age successfully were Pope and Dr. Johnson, and so the Classical Age is divided into three distinct periods. So basically the Classical Age or the Augustan Age or the 18th century literature is divided into three periods or three ages. One is the age of Dryden, the other one is the age of Pope and Dr. Johnson. So students, here you can see that along with the history of English literature, we are talking about different poets and writers as well. So you just have to keep in mind the writers who belong to any particular era. The age of Pope. Now we'll discuss about different ages in the 18th century literature. The age of Pope, that was started in 1700 and ended up in 1744. The earlier part, that was the earlier part of the 18th century or the Augustan Age, that is called the Age of Pope. Though there were a number of other important writers like Addison and Swift, but Pope was the only one who devoted himself completely to literature. That is why we have given this name to 18th century, the early 18th century literature, the Age of Pope. So that the dominating literary figure of 18th century literature was Pope. We are talking about the early half of the 18th century. He represented in himself all the main characteristics of his age, and his poetry served as a model to others. So he wrote marvelous books of poetry. So he is the dominating figure as well. So there are no doubt there were too many other good writers like Addison and Swift, but when we say who was the dominating figure of that very particular age, so we can say Pope. The Age of Johnson, that was started right after the Age of Pope, 1744, and ended in 1784. So here we'll focus on the works of Johnson as well. The later half of the 18th century, which was dominated by Dr. Samuel Johnson, is called the Age of Johnson. Johnson died in 1784, and from that time the classical spirit in English literature began to give place to the romantic spirit. So my dear students, here you can see the classical period or the Augustan period or the 18th century literature. After the death of Dr. Samuel Johnson in 1784, so it started giving birth to the Romanticism, the romantic movement in the history of English literature. Previously, the focus was on the classical literature, but here you can see a certain shift from classical literature to the Romantic literature. And officially, you can say the Romantic age started from the year 1798 when William Wordsworth and Coleridge published the famous lyrical ballad. Here you can see that with the publication of the lyrical ballads in 1798, the Romantic age was started, because the Romantic age was started. That is known as the age of transition in English literature as well, because there is a sudden shift, you can say, from the classical movement of English literature to the Romantic movement. So up till now we are basically dealing with the 18th century literature. Previously we talked about Dryden, then Pope, and now our focus is on Dr. Samuel Johnson. And my dear students, here you can see that how after the death of Dr. Samuel Johnson, the Romantic movement took over England, and the Romantic poets, how they introduced their new concepts in English society. Now that was all about the poetry. Now we will talk about the 18th century literature. The discovery of the modern novel, which at present is the most widely read and influential type of literature. The novel in its elementary form as a work of fiction written in prose was as first established in England by two authors, Bunyan and Defoe, who took advantage of the public interest in autobiography. So at that time you can see the interest of the people, they were very much interested in reading autobiographies. So Bunyan and Defoe, they took the advantage of people's interest and they started writing autobiographies, and the very first time they introduced the concept of novel in the history of English literature, and which is most widely read and influential type of literature even today. People prefer reading novel much as compared to any other genre of English literature. The books of Bunyan, whether they are told in the first person or not, were meant to be autobiographical, and their interest is subjective. So no doubt Bunyan's interest was subjective. So still they were very popular. He produced very popular novels, and because they were based on the autobiographical, maybe they were told in the first person pronoun. Maybe they were told in the first person or not, but there is an element of autobiography present there in his writings, and which gave the subjective opinion as well. The Romantic age. Here you can see, previously we were talking about the classical age in the history of English literature. So now our focus is on the Romantic age. As I told you that there is a sudden shift from classical movement to the Romantic movement in the history of English literature, and that took birth with the publication of the lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge. The Romantic age in the history of English literature started in 1798 and was ended up in 1824. This is known as the most fruitful period in the history of English literature. The revolt against the classical school. My dear students, here you can see the revolt against the classical school, which had been started by the writers like Chatterton, Collins, Gray, Burne, Cowper, etc., reached its climax during this period. So that was a period of a high climax for these writers, how they took the revolt against the classical movement, how they went against the classical movement in the history of English literature, and then how they introduced the romantic, you can say romanticism in literature. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley and Keats belong to this period. So my dear students, here you can see, like here we are talking about the Romantic age or the 18th, you can say, if we talk about, give it a name of the 18th century literature as well, and some of the periods, some of the part of the 19th century as well. So the well-known poets are William Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley and Keats, and they belong to this Romantic age. So whenever somebody asks you who are the Romantic poets, so you just have to give them the name Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley and Keats. So here you can see that learning history of or studying history of English literature, that is very interesting. It's like a story. Different characters are there in form of poets and in form of writers. according to different literary movements, political movements which were going on there and during that particular period. So studying history of English literature, that is just like a story. So my dear students, you have to take it like a story, then it would be very interesting for you. Just come to the point, that is the Romantic Age. While talking about the Romantic Age in detail, our focus would be on William Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley and Keats. Again, I'm telling you. So we'll focus on their works in detail when we talk about the Romantic Age. Now I will introduce 18th century drama to you people. 18th century drama is not considered on its peak during the 18th century. Why? Because there is a gradual deterioration, and during the last quarter of the century, drama was moving towards its lowest ebb. So people, they were not interested in drama as such, because they were moved towards reading novels and poetry, and nobody was interested in going to the theater and watch those traditional dramas only over there when there is a hero and based on, you know, very typical story, like there is a decline from the high place to the lowest, and the very typical story as well. So it depends upon the kind of political movements which were going on over there as well, and the credit goes to the novelists of the 18th century as well, that how they have given birth to a very new concept, that is of novel, in that very particular century. One of the reasons of the decline of drama during the 18th century was the Licensing Act of 1737, One of the reasons of the decline of drama during the 18th century was the Licensing Act of 1737, which curtailed the freedom of expression to dramatists. So, that is why people, they didn't feel like writing drama much, or they didn't feel like producing dramas as such because of this act. The result was that a number of writers like Fielding, who could make their marks as dramatists, left the theatre and turned towards the novel. So here you can see, as I told you before, that the credit goes to the novelists of that very era, that how they replaced novels with dramas because of that act as well. And here, my dear students, you can see that Henry Fielding, who is a great novelist in the history of English literature, he moved towards writing novels, although he could produce best dramas as well. So due to certain restrictions in that very era, so he went towards, you can say, writing novels, and he preferred writing novels as compared to dramas, because due to certain restrictions on dramatists of that period. Poets of the Romantic Age can be classified into three groups. So basically there are three groups of poets in the Romantic Age. The Lake School, consisting of Wordsworth, Coleridge and Southey. So my dear students, here you can see that how we have divided the poets of Romantic Age into three groups. One group is that of the Lake School. One group is that of the Lake School, consisting of William Wordsworth, Coleridge and Southey. The other group is the Scott group, including Campbell and Moore. And the third group comprising Byron, Shelley and Keats. So here basically they all are the Romantic poets, but we have classified them into different groups according to their thoughts, according to their writing pattern and many other things which are involved in writing poetry of that era. So Romantic Age, here you can see, let me revise the things for you, that how there was a sudden transition from one age to another one. Previously there was a classical movement going on in the history of English literature, and then the Romantic movement took place after the death of Dr. Samuel Johnson, and when Coleridge and Wordsworth, they published the lyrical ballads as well. So here you can see there is a sudden change from the classical ages or the Augustan ages of English literature to the Romantic Age in the history of English literature, and this is a very important period, and that is a very fruitful period as well. You can say this is a landmark in the history of English literature. Prose writers of Romantic Age, here our focus is not just on the poets of the Romantic Age. Basically, we talked about the novelists of the Romantic Age plus the dramatists of the Romantic Age and the poets as well. Now our focus is on the prose writers of Romantic Age. Though the Romantic period specialized in poetry, there appeared a few prose writers like Lamb, Hazlitt and De Quincey who rank very high. There was no revolt of the prose writer against the 18th century comparable to that of the poets, but a change had taken place in the prose style also. So basically, the Romantic Age was dominated by the poets of that era, not by the prose writers, but at least they introduced the prose in literature as well, right? So basically, when we will talk about the Romantic Age in the history of English literature, so you have to keep in mind, my dear students, that is about the poets. So that is a landmark as well. So we will particularly focus on the works of different poets of that era. So you can see that how we have divided poets into 3 different groups as well. So to some extent we'll focus on the prose writers as well, and here you can see, you can write down their names as well. The prose writers of the Romantic Age were Lamb, Hazlitt and De Quincey, and they are ranked very high in the Romantic Age as far as their prose writings are concerned. Novelists of the Romantic Age, the greatest novelists of this period are Jane Austen and Scott. So here you can see the novelists, they produce very good books in the Romantic Age, and their names are Jane Austen and Scott. So with the passage of time, the interest would be developed in you, because this is just a representation, a very short presentation on the entire history of English literature. So there are thousands of things which are involved, like there are many writers who belong to Romantic Age or the Restoration Age or the Classical period, the Geisson period. So my dear students, I'm just giving you a gist of the entire history of English literature only. The Victorian Age, another period after the Romantic movement in the history of English literature. The Victorian Age started in 1832 and was ended in 1900. So that is also known as the 19th century literature as well. This age in English literature began in second quarter of the 19th century and ended by 1900, as I told you. The Victorian Age ought to correspond with the reign of Queen Victoria, which extended from 1837 to 1901. Yet literary movements really coincide with the exact royal accession or death. So here you can see the political figures which are very much important during one period. King Victoria ruled over England during that period. So that is why this is known as the Victorian Age as well. From the year 1798, with the publication of the lyrical ballads, which I told you before, till the year 1820, there was the prime of Romanticism in England, but after that year there was a sudden decline. So here you can see the shift in the history of English literature. Previously that was from the classical or the Geisson ages to the Romantic movement in the entire history of English literature, and now we are moving towards the Victorian Age. So you can see the very fruitful period in the history of English literature is that of the Romantic poets. So they ruled over there, and their publications are very much famous, and you can see that how they took place. It was with the publication of the lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and Coleridge, and they ruled over there until the year you can say 1920. So there is a sudden decline after that, and then the Victorian period took over England. So here, my dear students, you can see the political personalities which are also involved and the political movements which are also involved. So we'll focus on them as well, the factors, the other factors which are there in deciding any period or any age in the history of English literature. So in Victorian age, you just have to keep in mind that it was the reign of Queen Victoria, and that age was started in 1832 and was ended up in 1900. Poets of the early Victorian period. So here we have divided Victorian period into two further, you can say, periods. One is the early Victorian period and the other one is the later Victorian period. So who were the poets in the early Victorian period? The most important poets during that period were Tennyson and Browning, with Arnold occupying a somewhat lower position. So, dear students, who were the poets in the early Victorian period? They were Tennyson and Browning and Arnold. So, students, again, let me clarify the concept. Like here, we won't just focus on Tennyson or Browning or Arnold only. We'll go with too many other things. We will go with too many other poets and writers of that particular era as well. But the dominating figures of that period were Tennyson, Browning and Arnold, with the, somehow you can say, with the lower position of that period. So Tennyson and Browning were the dominating figure of that era, that is early Victorian period. So here you have to keep in mind that the Queen Victoria was ruling over England during this period. Novelists. Previously that was about poets, so now this is about the novelists of the early Victorian period. During that period, the novel made a rapid progress. Novel reading was one of the chief occupation of the educated public, and material had to be found for every taste. So novel reading was very much common about masses and about the educated class of that era as well. And novelists, they started writing novels according to old tastes, they started writing about romance, about terror, about, you can say, horror, and you can say about which are based on harsh issues or the harsh realities of life as well. So here you can say they started writing according to different tastes. That is why they made a rapid progress. The result was that the scope of the novel, which during the 18th century dealt mainly with contemporary life and manners, was considerably enlarged. So it was on a larger position over here. Basically in novels the focus was basically on life, on different characters in the society. So that was on a very larger position here, which took birth in the 18th century literature. A number of brilliant novelists showed that it is possible to adapt the novel to almost all purposes of literature whatsoever. So whatsoever the purpose of literature is, so you can write each and everything in the novel. You can adapt the novel and you can present any kind of reality in novel. So that is very much important. That is why they made progress in the Victorian age. So that was a golden period for the novelist as well. So my dear students, when we will talk about the Victorian age in detail, so basically we will focus on the novelists of that very era, along with the poets and the prose writers and dramatists if we had any. So here we are talking about the novels. Okay, now we are moving towards the later period of Victorian age. So first of all, as I told you, that novelists, they dominated in that period, that is known as the Victorian period. So we'll talk about the novelists of the later Victorian period over here. And the novels written during the period may be called modern novels. The term modern novels, that is relevant to the novels which were written in the Victorian age. George Eliot was the first to write novels in the modern style. So here, while talking about the novelists in the later Victorian period, basically our focus would be on George Eliot first, and then we'll talk about other writers, novelists as well. So basically the thing is that George Eliot started writing novel in the modern style for the very first time in the later period of Victorian Age. Other important novelists of the periods were Meredith and Hardy. So obviously we'll focus on these novelists as well. The point is that the George Eliot started writing novels for the very first time in modern style in the Victorian Age, and then the other figures, the dominating figures you can say in the Victorian Age were Meredith and Hardy. So when we will talk about Victorian Age or the later period in Victorian Age, so definitely we'll focus on other novelists as well. Prose writers of the later Victorian period. In the later Victorian period, there were two great prose writers, Newman and Pater. So these are the dominating figures in prose writing in Victorian period. Newman was the central figure of the Oxford movement. So here you can see that we have two movements. One is the Oxford movement and the other one is the aesthetic movement in English poetry. So here you can see that Newman, the first one, was the central figure of the Oxford movement, and the later one, Pater, was an aesthete who inspired the leaders of the aesthetic movement in English poetry. So, my dear student, you don't need to get worried about anything, that what is this Oxford movement or what is this aesthetic movement. We'll talk about all the movements in detail when we'll be talking about, the later Victorian period or the early Victorian Age. So these were the two movements which you have to keep in mind, and the prose writers were Newman and Pater. One belonged to the Oxford movement and the other one aesthetic movement in English poetry. So how they inspired and how they started writing prose, so we'll focus on each and everything. Let me recall some of the things from the lecture which we have covered so far. Basically, we talked about Anglo-Saxon literature, Anglo-Norman literature, and then that is, you can say also known, the Anglo-Saxon literature is also known as the Old English literature, and then the Anglo-Norman literature, and then that is known as the Middle English literature, and then classical ages in the history of English literature. Then you can say the Romantic movements in the history of English literature, and then Renaissance period as well, the Victorian Age in the history of English literature. So now we are towards the modern literature that was started in you can say 1900 and ended up in 1961. So this is again a very important era in the history of English literature that is known as the modern literature. This era, this age was started from the beginning of the 20th century and it followed the Victorian Age. So it came right after the Victorian Age. It is opposed to the general attitude to life and its problems adopted by the Victorian writers and public, which may be termed Victorian. So whenever we talk about Victorian, so that's a typical mentality, people take it in a very traditional and typical way, Victorian writers. So they think that they have a very traditional and a very typical mentality. So modern literature rejected the, you can say, mentality of the Victorian writers or the Victorian poets, and they came up with the very new concept of writing literature. The young people during the first decade of the present century regarded the Victorian Age as hypocritical and the Victorian ideals as mean, superficial and stupid. So again, students, you can see that how these ages, these are different from each other. Fine. So in modern literature, the young people of that society, they considered Victorian literature as full of hypocrisy and stupidity and superficial things, and they consider the ideals as very mean and very stupid. So that is the thing. And you can see that how modern literature took its place by rejecting the Victorian mentality here. So that is why this literature is different. That is why we have given them different names like Victorian Age or the modern age, and we will see that how modern literature rejected the typical mentality of the Victorian poets and writers. Modern poetry, of which T.S. Eliot is the chief representative. Again, my dear students, you have to keep in mind different writers or the poets of any particular era. So the dominating figure of modern poetry is T.S. Eliot. He is the representative of chief representative of the poetry, has followed entirely a different tradition from the Romantic and Victorian tradition of poetry. So here you can see that why he is a modern poet, because he took a very new approach towards poetry, because he rejected the ideas and the thoughts of the Romantic and Victorian poets. Every age has certain ideas about poetry, especially regarding the essentially poetical subjects, the poetical materials and the poetical moods. So same is the case with this era in the history of English literature. As I told you that they rejected the Victorian concept and the Victorian thoughts and the ideas. So here they came up with an entirely new concept in poetry. So that is basically about new things, about new poetical subjects, about new poetical materials and the poetical moods as well. So here you can see a shift from the Victorian age to the modern age as well, that how they have rejected the concepts of the Victorian poets and they came up with the new you can say tradition, and they introduce, you can say, how they have introduced the new tradition in the history of English literature. Modern drama. After the death of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, drama in England suffered a decline for about 2 centuries. So drama was very much popular in Elizabethan age or in the age of Shakespeare, but drama faced certain decline for 2 centuries after the death of Shakespeare and his contemporaries who used to write during that era, that in the Elizabethan age. Even Congreve in the 17th and Sheridan and Goldsmith in the 18th century could not restore drama to the position it held during the Elizabethan age. So my dear students, you can see in the Romantic age poetry was on the peak, okay, and during the Elizabethan age drama was on the peak. So there are certain phases during which any genre of literature was on the peak. So in literature drama was neglected for about 2 centuries, and here you can see that even different very good dramatists like Sheridan, Goldsmith, they cannot restore drama during the 17th century, and the position which the drama had during the 18th century, that was a very higher position, you know, and those dramas, those plays are still very popular among masses of all ages and everywhere as well. It was revived, however, in the last decade of the 19th century, and then there appear dramatists who have now given it a respectable place in English literature. So this is a revival of the drama in the history of English literature, that is known as the modern drama as well. Fine. This period is also known as the revival of the drama as well, because drama was on its peak during the Elizabethan age, and then it faced a decline for the 2 centuries, and then the credit goes to the dramatists of the modern era in the history of English literature, that how they revived English drama again in the literature. So this is again very much important. The modern novel. This is the most important and popular literary medium in the modern times. So still, even today, drama is very much even today novel is very much famous. Even today novel is very much popular among people of all societies. So it is the only literary form which can compete for popularity with the film and the radio, and it is in this form that a great deal of distinguished work is being produced. So dear students, here the concept is that how novel can compete with the film, with the television and with the radio. So again, you know, the tradition is still same even today, that people, they prefer reading novel as compared to reading any kind of poetry or drama. The writers have set a tradition during the modern period in the history of English literature of producing best novels of English. Poetry, which had many centuries held the supreme place in the realm of literature, had lost that possession. So here you can see, my dear students, again, as I told you before, that in Romantic period poetry was on the top, in the Victorian period novel was on the top, and in the modern period, here you can see the novel is again on the top. Okay, so here you can see that novel is again on the top. So poetry lost its position to some extent. Why? Because of the new trends in the literature. Its appeal to the general public is not negligible, and it had been obviously superseded by fiction. So here you can see that this is something which everyone can read, and that is written in a very direct language as well, and there are certain characters, and that is based on the story, so everybody can understand a novel. So that is why it took poetry's place here in the modern period of the literature. Postmodern literature, that is very much important, and this is right after the modern literature. So first of all, the thing which I want you to understand from the word postmodernism is that what is basically the concept behind it. Until the 1920s, the term modern used to mean new or contemporary, but thereafter it came to be used for a particular period, the one between the two world wars, that is 1914 to 1945. So here you can see previously modern was used to mean new and contemporary ideas, or you can say literature as well. But here they came up with another new thing, that is the postmodern literature. So what do we mean by that? That is you can say a particular period. So we are categorizing basically modern literature to from the period 1914 to 1945. So that is known as the modern period between the two world wars. So you can say the period between the two world wars was known as the modern period in the history of English literature. Then came up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then came up after about half a century the magic term postmodernism, meaning the period after the modern. So that is, post means after. So the period after the you can say the two world wars, that is known as the postmodern. So they came up with the absolute new things regarding literature. So they come up with the subjectivity as well, and this leads us towards the and this leads us towards the qualitative research in literature as well. They rejected objectivity. Postmodern you can say theorists, they rejected objectivity, and they rejected the scientific things in the society, and they think that everything that whatsoever is there, the subjective element is present. So there is a shift from the modern thought to the postmodern thoughts, and that is why this is known as the postmodern literature, that is right after the modern literature. Postmodern drama, the new theatre. Drama of the post-war period shares the dominant spirit of the age we have witnessed in novel and poetry from the 1950s onwards. So postmodern drama took its place in this era, and the writers, they produced very good dramas during this period, and they took the place of the poetry and novel during the postmodern period. Okay. Postmodern criticism. So here previously we were talking about drama, novels, prose and poetry. So this is a new thing, that is criticism. So that is present in the postmodern era only in the entire history of English literature. So Until the time of the modern period of English literature, literary criticism was a literary activity only. So basically that was not criticism, that was just a literary activity to write down something, and that's it. Basically that was not criticism in its true sense. With dealing, call them policy, document written by the leaders of the literary movement. So basically that literary activity was being done by the leaders of any particular literary movement. Basically that was not literary criticism, that was just a literary activity. That can be any kind of writing which is not criticism. We know how from Dryden and Pope and Johnson to Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats to Ireland and Rossetti and Swinburne to Eliot and Auden and Spender, English poetics was theorized by the leading English poets. So that is like, for example, if we read Wordsworth for player purposes only, so there won't be any criticism as such. So the postmodern critics, they introduced the term criticism there, whatever that is there, as I told you, that they challenged objectivity. So they rejected universality as well, the thing that the opinions are different from individual to individual, and the element of subjectivity is present in all works of the poets and the writers. So here you can see they challenged the traditional literature, or you can say the typical literature that is written, so they challenged the previous literature that was written in English language. So that is a new terminology in the postmodern, that is based on the critical theory as well. So hopefully we'll talk about hopefully we'll talk about critical theory as well, and the effects of critical theory on postmodern literature as well. So the reference books which I have followed for today's lecture are from A Critical History of English Literature, that is by Dr. B.R. Mullik, A Dictionary of Literary Terms by Martin Gray, and A Critical History of English Literature by David Ditches. So my dear students, whatever we have discussed so far, that is about the history of English literature. I just wanted to give you a very short briefing of history of English literature, although that is not possible to cover the entire history in one lecture only. I just have introduced the different ages and the periods in the history of English literature, and how English literature developed with the passage of time, and how it took birth to new concepts with the passage of time. I just want to revise this lecture for you today, because this is the very first time I have introduced history of English literature to you people. So here we took a start with the we took a start with what do we mean by age or period, and how do we classify different ages and periods according to what? That was a very complicated question, and I can understand your situation, that how confused you would be while doing with the ages and the periods. So again I'm telling you that you don't need to follow any age or period or any century strictly, just have to clarify the concept in your mind, that who are the most dominating figures of that very era, and how these social, political and economical plus the class differences affect the English literature, that these things are very much important. So we took a start with the Anglo-Saxon literature. So basically that Anglo-Saxon literature has a very long history in the entire history of English literature. So that was started when Anglo and Saxon, these are the names of the two tribes, they conquered England and they ruled over there for many years. Fine. So we can find out the reflection of their thoughts and their, you can say, mentality in the literature of that time. And they were very brave people, they were very adventurous as well. So that is shown through their literature, and that is also known as Old English period. Okay. Then we move towards Anglo-Norman period, and when the people of Normandy, definitely they were known as Normans, they took the charge and they defeated Anglo-Saxons in the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and how they took over England, and then there was Renaissance period, the age of revival, or you can say the age of reason as well, right? So then we have discussed the age of Pope, the Restoration period, the Puritan Age, the 18th century novel, and the Elizabethan period, the Victorian Age, and then the modern novel and the post-modern, and the modern period in the history of English literature, along with the post-modern period. So again, I'm telling you, my dear students, that you don't need to follow strictly all the ages and the periods in the history of English literature. The thing which you have noticed, the thing which you have to notice is that you just know how English language developed with the passage of time, and what were the elements which are there, and what were the typical thoughts of any particular age or any particular period. That's your business, and you don't need to remember all the dates and everything. So that is why at the start of the lecture I told you that you have to take things in a very casual way, in a very informal way, like take it as a story, that English language, history of English literature is 1, 2, 3. That history of English literature is just like a story, that how different people, they conquered different parts of England and they ruled over there, and what kind of products they produced, and what were the typical mentality or typical mentalities or the thoughts of that very particular era, and how they rejected the previous age. For example, as we have seen in the modern era, that they used to say this Victorian age as the age of stupidity and the age of hypocrisy, right? So they were later on rejected by the modern period, that was rejected. The modern thoughts were later on rejected by the post-modern era. So here you can see different transitions in the phases in the development of. So here, my dear students, you can say the different transitions in the entire history of English literature, that how it got birth in England, and then the development and then the growth of English literature. So far I guess you have enjoyed today's lecture, and basically that was just the gist of different eras. So in the following lectures, in the next lectures, we will be talking about for example, the Anglo-Saxon literature in detail, what kind of books they have written, and about the transcript as well of that age, and the typical thoughts of that age, and how social, economical and political factors were involved there in producing the literature. So these things are very much important when we study literature, so we have to keep in mind. So this literature is not just only to read out anything for pleasure purposes, and to read out any novel or any poem. It's not like that. We have to keep in mind that how certain factors from the society, they influence writing the so how certain factors in society, they influence the writing of any work. So my dear students, so far we have studied a gist of all the ages. So the reference books or the course books which you have to consult for the details of today's lecture are these 3 books, and these books are easily available in the market. So you have to focus on these 3 books only, and if I find any other good book, so I'll definitely recommend you that book as well. So my dear students, again I'm telling you that today's lecture was just a gist of the history of English literature, the different phases and the different ages, and we just discussed in a nutshell about the typical thoughts of any particular age. So in the next lectures we'll talk about every age in detail. So hope you had a very good time with me, and again I'm telling you that history is not at all a boring subject, the kind of usually people take it boring, but for me and for you If you start studying it like a story, so it would be very interesting for you and you'll understand the things in a better way. So hope you had good time with me, and I also enjoyed delivering today's lecture because of my interest in history of English literature. So inshallah, see you tomorrow again with the new topic relevant to history of English literature. Thank you so much.